All right. Well, I have 101, so we'll assume everybody got on the line now. I'm really excited today. My name is Luke Shabro. I'm the Deputy Director for the Army Mad Scientist Initiative. And this series, or this event today, is part of our series on the weaponization of information. So we're really excited to have some fantastic presentations for a panel today. As we look through this campaign has been really excellent. We originally planned on with our partners at Georgetown University at the Center for Security Studies. We originally planned on a physical conference that was going to take place this summer, as we usually do with them every year, a longtime partner. But due to coronavirus, what we decided to do was a virtual campaign, which has been really successful for us in terms of getting some great outside insights, getting some real finite looks at the weaponization information. So the first presentation we had was from Mr. Vincent O'Neill on the information destruction industry, which was really widely participated in, a fantastic event there. And Mr. O'Neill is actually a science fiction writer as well. And then the following week, we had Pete Singer and August Cole, the authors of Ghost Fleet and their newest novel, Burn In. And so we had them talk about fictionalized intelligence, what that looked like in terms of the weaponization of social media. So a lot of great topics and some serious discussion there. And then Mark Persard and Dr. Christopher Paul from the RAND Corporation talked to us recently about manufacturing AI, or rather manufacturing reality with AI. And finally, ongoing, we have a vignette writing contest that everyone is encouraged to participate in. If you check out our blog, it's the MadSci Laboratory, madsciblog.tradoc.army.mil. Make sure you're following us on Twitter at ArmyMadSci to see all the details for the writing contest there. And we're going to be participating later in July with a vignette wargaming exercise. And then on the 21st of July, we're going to have a full day event with Georgetown University, where we're going to talk about all these aspects of the weaponization information, as well as the solution spaces with groups like DARPA and the State Department as well. So we have a lot of exciting things going on, but today we are really excited for this event to have panels from Georgetown University. We have folks from the School of Foreign Services Centennial Labs. And so we're really excited. And so the way this is going to work today is that we're going to have the panelists present their information, their excellent and detailed research, and then we're going to allow about 10 minutes for questions for the first panel. And then what we'll do is move on to the second panel, and then we'll allow about 10 more minutes for questions for that. And then we'll see what remaining questions we have. We want to make sure that we address questions that are relevant to each panel individually. So for the first set of questions, keep it on the first panel. On the second, keep it on the second panel. And please utilize the Q&A function in the Zoom webinar. So that way we don't clog the chat up with a lot of questions. It becomes harder to track. So put your Q&A in there and we'll go ahead and answer it as we go through. So we're really excited today. So the first group that we have is going to be talking about the content blitz, quantifying the Islamic State's impact on the Saudi Twitter sphere. So we're actually really excited. So we have Fiona Singer, Henry Mim, and Ines Aluman. I apologize if I butcher that name. So I'm going to allow them to go ahead and introduce themselves, and then we'll go ahead and get started. Thanks, everyone, for coming on.
Hi, thank you so much for having us. I'm actually going to start by sharing our slides, and we will introduce ourselves there. Okay, wonderful. So welcome to our presentation. Again, the content blitz, quantifying the Islamic State's impact on the Saudi Twitter sphere. So to begin with introductions, welcome to the team. My name is Fiona Singer. I'm a 2020 graduate from the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown. At Georgetown, I was what's known as a culture and politics major, and I spent a lot of time looking at disinformation and privacy online. And I will be joining Palantir in August as a privacy and civil liberties engineer.
Hi, I'm Henry. I, like Fiona, also graduated from Georgetown School of Foreign Service in May, where I studied science, technology, and international affairs with a concentration in security. And in August, I'll be starting as a research assistant at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy.
Hello, everyone. My name is Ines Ulamin. I too graduated from Georgetown School of Foreign Service in December of 2019. I studied regional and comparative studies, mainly looking at politics and security in the Middle East and North Africa region, as well as US foreign policy there. And I will be starting at a law firm called Kober & Kim in about a week.
Awesome. And thank you very much for having us today. We're very excited to share this research. By way of a little bit of background, here's an overview of our slides. So we'll begin with an introduction, then go through some research questions, our literature review, methodology, the kind of data that we ended up analyzing, and then the relevance of this research. So to begin with just a little bit of background on the study, this was born out of a 2019 fall class taught by Daniel Byman, who many of you are probably familiar with. We actually didn't want to look at ISIS, ironically. As many of you may know, in the kind of disinformation space, ISIS was kind of the original bad actor, and a lot of social media companies actually began investing in their policy teams and their disinformation teams to solve the ISIS issue online. And when we came into this kind of research sphere in 2019, we understood that the majority of research on kind of bad actors online was about ISIS. And we kind of viewed it as an issue that had been solved for. So in 2014, for instance, if you were to go onto Twitter, the algorithm would like literally suggest to you like the next jihadi that you could go follow. It was incredibly transparent. And now it's virtually impossible to find ISIS content on English language Twitter. However, we were really interested in the Saudi Twitter sphere. We noticed that there was an incredible amount of spam and misinformation on there. But every single time we would go in a specific hashtag that was trending online, we would find ISIS content. And we found it really strange and really striking that we were finding this. So our research project was really an effort to understand why this was happening and an attempt to quantify this. Some other information that's relevant to this research: Saudi Arabia is the largest Twitter community in the Middle East and the 5th largest market in the entire world. They account for 40% of the Middle East Twitter user base. So it's a really profitable market for Twitter. However, it's really underinvested by Twitter. That'll definitely be a theme in our research. As we've talked about, there's an incredible amount of inauthentic accounts and inauthentic behavior that's happening online. The amount of spam that we saw while doing this research is pretty crazy. There's also a lot of pornographic content online. There's a lot of state-sponsored misinformation that also plays a role in perhaps why Saudi Arabia hasn't been more proactive on this issue. And then while Twitter has been really proactive on English language platforms, there has been this lag when it comes to non-English language markets when it comes to ISIS content. Research questions.
And so our project focused on 2 specific research questions. So after seeing all of this Islamic State content on our initial looks at the trending hashtags in Saudi Arabia, we wanted to determine, first of all, what techniques the Islamic State was using. So we wanted to figure out exactly how they were able to spread their content so effectively on these hashtags. And our second focus was determining, quantifying specifically how impactful this was, because we saw anecdotally that there was a lot of this content that was not very challenging to find on these Arabic language Saudi hashtags, but we wanted to exactly figure out what the quantified impact of that was.
Yeah, definitely. So to begin with a literature review, to give you some context about how revolutionary our study was, to boil it down very succinctly, the main kind of thesis of our literature review was that there was little to no work that focused on how ISIS overlaps with Arab or Gulf states, including Saudi Arabia. And in particular, there was no kind of quantitative research that was looking at the impact of this overlap between the Saudi Twitter ecosystem and then ISIS content. So to begin with the first half of that, ISIS on Twitter, as I said before, there's been a lot of research that's looked at ISIS between the periods of 2014 to 2016. To give you a sense of how astronomical, like the ISIS's presence was at this time. The average ISIS account had thousands of followers. And so there was really like a cult of personality around your favorite jihadi. You would watch them go to Syria, you'd watch their life in Syria. It was very much like a personality-driven machine. So accounts would have thousands of followers. The average takedown window ranged from like months and even years at the beginning. And then gradually since 2014, it's shrunk. So the last figure, like legitimate figure that we found was that in 2019, the window was about 17 hours. But anecdotally, we've seen that window shrink even more. And so when it comes to how the content was actually distributed, it seems like the distribution mechanisms are relatively stable. So you would have official creators who would, shoot content. So they would often be like battle scenes, acts of brutality, and then jihadists were used to kind of share this propaganda information online. And so they would usually split down longer videos into 2-minute segments, and then that information would be distributed, and jihadists would overlay music, infographics, images, to kind of make it like pop online and make it more accessible. And then when it came to propaganda, these kind of propaganda themes were actually taken from Charlie Winter and his like typology of how he was finding ISIS content online, but they do seem to be relatively stable as well. So brutality, mercy, victimhood, belonging, war, and utopianism. If people have questions about those specifically, we can drill down more. But we essentially took that schematic and then updated it to be a little bit more relevant to the Saudi sphere in particular. So then what I find a little more interesting, the ISIS-Saudi overlap. So as many of you may know, there's this tension between Wahhabi Islam and then the radical Salafi Islam that ISIS adheres to. And interestingly, there is a lot in common, and often in early ISIS propaganda, you would actually find a lot of references to Saudi Arabia. But there's also this tension because, of course, the kingdom is a legitimate nation state, and so ISIS threatening it territorially or militarily is really, really dangerous. And so there's also been a lot of tension in that way. Of course, Saudi Arabia does have a close relationship with the US, and so that also adds tension. So there has been specific ISIS terror attacks in the kingdom, but generally we'll tell you more about what this kind of looks like when it comes to online propaganda. Two studies that I would really like to highlight, which are a few of the only studies that we could find that actually looked at the kind of ISIS overlap with Saudi Arabia. So firstly, in 2015 to 2016, RAND conducted a review of 23 million tweets under two hashtags, hashtag Islamic State and hashtag Daesh in Arabic. And they found that while there weren't that many pro-ISIS Saudi tweeters, it was dominant to find pro-ISIS content within Saudi Arabia. And then our second piece of information, which was relevant, was a Brookings study, I believe from 2016, that found that Saudi Arabia was had the third most geolocated accounts tweeting pro-ISIS support. And it was actually third after Iraq and Syria. And every other account, every other location in the region was only tweeting about 6% of the geolocated tweeters, while Saudi represented 27% of supporters. So a very, very significant proportion. And this does translate into on the ground support. So Saudi Arabia has the most citizens that have gone and become foreign fighters for ISIS. It's believed that about 5% of the Saudi population is in favor of ISIS, according to a 2015 report, although that most likely has evolved since. So the overlap between these two entities is really interesting and significant.
So that brings us to our data collection and analysis methodology. And so we collected data over the course of a week from November 18th to November 24th of 2019. And so our first step was identifying the trending Twitter hashtags in Saudi Arabia. And so we've added a little graphic on the side to show how you can do this. As you can see, the underlying United States trends. So you can determine the trends for a specific country if you go to this little gear. that allows you to change the country that you're looking at for trends. So we would change our trends to Saudi Arabia so that despite not being in the kingdom, we are still able to see what hashtags were trending there. And so using that, we're able to use a tool called Twint to download every single tweet over the course of that day that we are collecting on that mentioned that specific hashtag by doing a phrase specific collection. So you would insert the hashtag into Twint and it would scrape all of these into a comma separated value file. And then we would use a shared Google Drive to store all of this data. And so in total, we collected 109,000 Arabic language tweets produced by over 60,000 accounts. And so after that, we used different tools in Python to analyze the data, and that allowed us to identify the most frequent tweeters, so the accounts that tweeted the most in our specific data set. And so after identifying those accounts, we would go on to Twitter and search them to see if they were still up, and if they were, the kind of content that they were tweeting. And we determined if they were ISIS by seeing if they were tweeting specific ISIS branded content, which is usually fairly easily identifiable by the Black Standard and certain kind of themes of violence and promotion of the caliphate. And then so after doing that, we would calculate different metrics for accounts, such as how frequently specific IS accounts were tweeting versus how frequently normal accounts were tweeting. And then at the end, we also did some data visualization, which we will see later in the PowerPoint.
Sorry, it's hard to navigate all different parts of Zoom. So to begin with an overview of our key trends, we'll give you a general breakdown and then we'll drill down into these throughout the rest of the presentation. But firstly, the ISIS operation was really content driven instead of this more personality driven model that I referenced earlier, that the 2014 to 2016 studies of Twitter and ISIS were really studying. So accounts were highly expendable. We'll show you some pretty funny examples of this, but essentially accounts were up for a number of hours and then they would be taken down. And so really it was about virality within those couple of hours. We found this really interesting model where a hub account would disseminate key videos and then other accounts would reference that prior account, and we'll give you a sense of what that actually looked like on the platform. And then content was coordinated day to day. So back to what Henry was saying about actually identifying content, ISIS made it quite easy for us to identify the content because on a given day, we'd be seeing a certain battle scene and we would see it over and over again on the platform. And then the next day it would change. And let's say on a given day, there might be 2 to 3 videos that were circulating. So our second key trend was that ISIS exerts outsized influence on tweet volume. So to give you a pretty crazy statistic, 77 ISIS accounts, validated ISIS accounts, generated about 12,000 tweets, or about 11.5% of that 100,000 tweets that we identified. So that's obviously a very significant chunk. But when it comes to how things actually trend in the algorithm, because they're disseminating the content so rapidly, it actually rises to the top of the kind of trending feed. And so anecdotally in November 2019, when we would go and click on a hashtag, within a few seconds, it would be the first content that we would see. And then Henry and Inez can pick up for the rest of this.
Yeah, so as Fiona was saying, the content is very easily accessible through an array of hashtags as well. We found that there was not a specific topic that ISIS was targeting with its content. Rather, it was just targeting the specific hashtags that Twitter was listing as trending in the kingdom at that moment. And like Fiona mentioned, the tweets would almost always be at the top of the latest tweets on that hashtag, just given the pure frequency of the operation.
Yeah, and also just anecdotally to give you a sense of how outrageous the kind of subjects that they would tweet on a given day, we were finding like K-pop hashtags that they were infiltrating. Soccer was very common. We got tweets about how it was cold outside in Saudi Arabia on a given day. Like they were very generous and liberal in terms of the kind of subjects they would tweet under.
Yes, and then fourth, we noticed that the Islamic State tended to join a hashtag once it had already gained popularity in Saudi Arabia. So on average, an ISIS tweet would emerge about 7.5 hours after the hashtag was first used. And in that time frame, the hashtag would enjoy natural rise and fall. ISIS does not generate its own hashtags, or even, we hypothesize, wait for any one in particular to gain popularity. This is what Fiona already spoke to. This is a purposeful and tactical decision to maximize the reach of its tweets, which are generated from just a handful of accounts. We're talking 5 to 15 accounts. And obviously then Saudi users are more likely to come across ISIS content if they are browsing a popular hashtag.
Yeah. And then our final key trend, ISIS is very deliberately targeting Saudi Arabia. So we'll show you very concrete examples, again, that attack the legitimacy of the Saudi state very purposefully. So we've already touched on this, but again, ISIS aims for big tweet volume by using a few key accounts. So I've already given you the statistic that 77 ISIS accounts produced around 12.5 thousand tweets, which were about 11% of our overall tweet collection. We found that 81% of the tweets produced by the top tweeting accounts were ISIS accounts. So on a given day, we would scrape and then we would look at the accounts that were tweeting the most. So out of a hashtag with maybe 2,000 tweets, the top tweeters would be responsible for hundreds of those tweets, and overwhelmingly those were ISIS accounts. To give you a sense of how many views these tweets were getting, ISIS videos were one way where we could actually track the amount of eyeballs that were getting to these tweets. And we found that over our 9 hashtags, the videos were getting a collected viewership of 350,000 views. So it was definitely gaining traction. And then a crazy statistic was that on November 21st, 14 accounts achieved the tweet speed, and we'll tell you more about that metric later, of almost 20,000 non-ISIS accounts combined. So they were definitely dominating online.
And so this is just a picture of kind of the average day that we collected. And so this was from November 24th, 2019. And so the hashtag we were collecting from roughly translates to the second leg from the pitch. It's a reference to the fact that Al Hilal, a Saudi soccer team, was in the second leg of the, I think, Asia Football Cup final. And so obviously that has nothing to do with ISIS specifically. It was just a popular hashtag that day that the Islamic State happened to hop on. And so as you can see from the pie graph on the left, Islamic State accounts accounted for a tiny fraction of the accounts that were tweeting on this hashtag, encompassing less than 0.5%. However, you can see by the other pie chart that their impact was significantly outsized given those numbers, because they accounted for 5.4% of all tweets on that hashtag. And that is just an example. And if you see in our next slide, it could be much worse than that. So on November 23rd, the day before, we have another hashtag. It's kind of like the great victory over, wait, I can't. It's a hashtag about the final of Al Hilal versus Urawa. And so you can see that Islamic State accounts, once again, less than 0.5% of all accounts tweeting on this. And they accounted for nearly a quarter of all tweets on this hashtag. And we're talking about thousands, tens of thousands of tweets on this hashtag. So I think this really visualizes how outsized the impact of these very few accounts were on these trends.
So time and again, our data demonstrated a really clear pattern. The Islamic State would join after several hours of a hashtag being trending and quickly dominate it in terms of both volume and frequency. In period of time before the first Islamic State tweet, the hashtags matured and achieved trending status. But once ISIS began tweeting, the operation would really scale pretty quickly. This pattern is really evident in the fourth hashtag we scraped, which this graph displays. This graph represents tweet speed over the course of one day, and we measured tweet speed by tweets per minute. So it's just the frequency of tweets per minute measured over time. A higher tweet speed indicates that more users are using a hashtag by generating new tweets, and that the hashtag is more likely to trend and gain prominence on Twitter. In green, we have the overall data set. So that is all the tweets in our data set on November 21st. And in black, we have the data set, which accounts for only the ISIS tweets. So we can really see the comparison in tweet speed over time for the ISIS accounts versus for all of the accounts. So on November 21st, we followed the hashtag al-bard, which means the cold. We've deduced it must have been rather cold in Saudi Arabia that day. And as we've mentioned before, in total, just 14 ISIS accounts generated about 2,600 tweets, or approximately 10% of all tweets on the hashtag. So again, we're seeing that really outsized influence there. As you can see, the hashtag first experiences a surge in use between 3 a.m. and 6 a.m. coordinated universal time, which is just the time zone that Twint defaults to. The tweet speed on the hashtag diminishes after around 6 a.m., but it remains higher than before it first began. The Islamic State first tweets on the hashtag when that initial surge begins to taper off around 8:45 a.m. And in the ensuing hours, the tweet speed for the hashtag picks up significantly more than in the first bump, in that first natural rise and fall before ISIS was using the hashtag. And so we were able to measure the exact tweet speed with and without the ISIS accounts, and we found the results to be very astounding. So looking first at the hashtag's overall tweet speed, it peaked at 3:53 p.m. at 76 tweets per minute. In that same minute, ISIS accounts reached a tweet speed of 38 tweets per minute, which is roughly half. In addition, these 14 accounts achieved a combined peak tweet speed that is roughly equivalent to the combined peak tweet speed of the remaining 19,000 non-ISIS accounts. And just to break that down, because I know the wording is a little confusing, those 14 accounts were able to tweet as fast as the remaining 19,000 accounts, which is very significant. At 1 p.m., the ISIS accounts tweeted at 46 tweets per minute, and around 4 p.m., the non-ISIS accounts tweeted at 47 tweets per minute. So you have just a 1 tweet difference there. This really shows that ISIS can produce an outsized effect on Twitter. And we'll talk a little bit about the mechanisms why next. Because Twitter's trending algorithm relies on volume and interaction, the high volume and speed of ISIS tweets means that the hijacked hashtags would remain trending longer, in turn increasing the reach of ISIS content. And we spoke before about how ISIS switched from an account-based model to a content-based model. And this is why this is so crucial here. It's all about getting the content out as fast as you can, and the actual accounts that you use are expendable, whereas before there was a real cult of personality around each account. You would follow your favorite jihadists and things like that. So lastly, as I've already said, the outsized impact of just 14 accounts indicates that the ISIS operation might be a bit more sophisticated than it might first appear.
And now we're going to look at how this kind of operation looks at the individual tweet level. And so here are a number of examples of different tweets we collected over the course of this project. And so as you can see by looking at them, they have a similar format. They all include a number of different hashtags. So they weren't necessarily focusing on one individual hashtag, but rather a number of different top trending hashtags from that day. And they all have the kind of timestamp after these hashtags. And we believe that this is a sign of, and you can see this in the tweets too. It indicates the source of the tweet in terms of like whether you tweeted it from, Twitter on like your laptop or Twitter mobile. And these tweets say that they're from If This Then That, which is a kind of a Twitter, it's kind of like a tweet deck thing where you can set up tweets to tweet before you, like ahead of time. And so we believe that the timestamp is indicative of this as well. And so, but there's also a number of different themes that the content that they're disseminating touches upon. And so, for example, the clip in the top left, the caption says, "It will totally change your point of view." And that's the video highlights ISIS's like bureaucratic skills and the different kind of administrative tasks that they they kind of gave out in Syria when they did control territory. And then the clip in the middle discusses outside intervention in the Syrian civil war. The clip in the top right discusses, it contrasts videos of young men from the Gulf at soccer matches. They're celebrating, they're kind of behaving rowdily, and it contrasts that with the supposed discipline and like upright moral standing of the fighters of the Islamic State. And then the videos in the bottom those two highlight different examples of violence by the Islamic State and different victories for them militarily. And so we see a wide range of themes being addressed in these videos. And all of the captions as well are fairly clickbaity. You see kind of a theme there, a clip that will totally change your point of view. It kind of encourages you to click on it and see exactly how it's going to change your mind, which was interesting. And so if you, on our next slide, we look at a specific thing that Fiona mentioned earlier, which was a hub and spoke account, a hub and spoke kind of operation. And so it would start with the hub account. And a hub account, as you can see from this example of a hub account, is not like outwardly supportive of the Islamic State. Like all of these, all the content that we found on this specific account, it did not mention the Islamic State, and it didn't tweet any videos. In fact, it hadn't tweeted in over 5 years. And so, however, if you go to the next slide, we'll see that the tweets from the different like videos that we showed earlier are all sourced from this account. And so if you see in the bottom left of each tweet, there is a little from thing where you can see where that video exactly came from. And so if you click on that, it would take you to the hub account. So all of these accounts, while they don't follow each other, they don't tweet at each other, are linked in this way to this specific hub account. And this is not the only thing that we saw when we were collecting tweets. We saw a number of accounts that were just kind of tweeting their own videos. But this hub and spoke kind of phenomenon is a really common thing that we saw over the course of our data collection and analysis.
So as Fiona explained earlier, there's a clear Wahhabi overlap between the two groups, but that is where the sympathies end. So we encountered anti-Saudi content throughout the course of our research. The Islamic State would target Saudi Arabia in an effort to sway the audience into distrusting Saudi Arabia's claims of religious and political legitimacy, and instead to perceive the Islamic State as the true state of Tawheed, which is a core Islamic concept that conveys the oneness of God. And this concept is also elevated in Salafism. So on this slide, we have an infographic published by the Islamic State on Twitter during the course of our research in November. It's entitled Get to Know Your Enemy, El Saud, and it juxtaposes the Islamic State with Saudi Arabia on political and religious grounds. It's an excellent example of the types of content we would come across. So in this infographic, much in like other media, the Islamic State seeks to prove that it and only it is carrying out the Wahhabi ideology and returning to Islam as it was at the time of the Prophet. And we see that in the upper left quadrant where the translation reads, they contradicted what was their duty as told by Sheikh and Imam Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab, who is the founder of Wahhabism, which later descended into Salafism as well. It also seeks to say that its wars have been justified while Saudi Arabia has fought against Muslims and betrayed the Ummah by fighting alongside the West. We see that in the bottom left and bottom right quadrants where there's a comparison between, like direct comparison between the wars that Saudi Arabia has engaged in and what side it's fought on versus the Islamic State. And it compares itself to Saudi Arabia in this way to show that it is the Salafist vanguard of Islam waging war against unbelievers such as Shias and Kurds, while Saudi Arabia engages in haram or like disallowed practices. Sorry, I just had a small technical issue with my computer. The Islamic State also, I thought this was quite interesting that it focused so much on this, but it seeks to show that it is following proper guidance on financial law, while Saudi Arabia does not. And this is featured in the upper right quadrant. So it's seeking to show that the Saudi state does not take or require zakat, which is the alms tax, or jizya, which is the non-Muslim tax, and engages in usury. And again, this is all to corrode the legitimacy of the Saudi state. And this is not the only example by far, but it just does a really great job of summarizing all of the different points that we would see across different videos and infographics like this.
And so to conclude, we should discuss why this is important. Starting off, these tweets have an absolutely massive impact. We saw one of the videos that we saw had over 100,000 views on November 22nd. And so this propaganda, likely in terms of concerns about radicalization, may not be as potent as face-to-face attempts at radicalization, or even kind of more personable chatting like attempts at radicalization online. However, it is still propaganda promoting a terrorist group, and obviously there are concerns around that we can't just ignore. Twitter has kind of done a good job of eliminating that more personable side of radicalization, but that does not mean that the problem is solved entirely. You see these videos up for hours, like we mentioned before. They're incredibly accessible, and they could kind of be perhaps a catalyzing factor that could draw people into a deeper rabbit hole of radicalization. And from a business standpoint for Twitter, it is important for them to clean up their platform in terms of people wanting to engage on their platform and stay on their platform. Like we mentioned, these are not appearing on hashtags that are related to the Islamic State. And that means that people who aren't looking for Islamic State propaganda could very easily stumble upon, say, a video of a beheading, of which we saw quite a few over the course of our data collection. And so for Twitter, they have an incentive to remove this kind of content, not only to prevent the dangers that it poses in terms of radicalization and promotion of a terrorist group on their platform, but simply to make their user experience better. And Twitter needs to act because we don't believe that the Saudi government is going to be especially stringent about this issue. As we discussed earlier in the presentation, the Saudi government runs a number of information operations on Twitter, as well as different social media platforms. And so it has no real interest itself in cleaning up the platform, because that may mean that its own operations would be affected. So the impetus really does have to come from Twitter. And we believe that this propaganda being out there and having such an impact could have serious repercussions for the region. And that's why we believe that Twitter needs to deal with this problem.
And if I may add one more thing, we actually were lucky enough to publish another research project that we did with Lawfare, where we looked at the Philippines and Facebook and disinformation that happens there. And I think these projects do have a lot in common, because they're both looking at abuse of non-English language or like non-Western platforms, and how disinformation, hate, is being disseminated relatively easily. So when we think about ISIS, again, in the West, we think of it as a problem that's pretty much been solved for online, but we're seeing that the kind of one issue that these companies feel like they've solved for, in fact, is a lot more complex when you actually look at it. And there's a lot of markets where this is being disseminated incredibly easily. And again, this is a huge market for Twitter. It is the 5th biggest one in the world, representing 40% of users within the Middle East. So there is a lot of money to be gained here, yet there's still very little investment. So I think at this point, we're going to open this up for Q&As, but thank you so much for including us today. We are really passionate about this research project, and it's amazing to be able to share it with you. So I'll stop sharing my screen.
Well, that was just absolutely phenomenal. Really appreciate you all presenting that work. The research was just detailed and excellent. And so we want to open up to questions. So we have a number of questions in our Q&A. First, I always go to my boss, Lee Grubbs, so that I can get those brownie points for later. But his question was, Is this a kind of narrative strategy where we see they're throwing spaghetti at a wall? You know, you mentioned earlier when you all were presenting this idea that sometimes the hashtags were completely unrelated, but it was just something that they put out there. Is it something that they see they want to stick, or does it become more sophisticated as we go on in time?
So because we did see hashtags being hijacked across a wide variety of subjects, we never really identified one focal point. I would say one thing to note, though, is that I think, maybe had 3 instances of soccer hashtags. Soccer is obviously hugely popular in Saudi Arabia, and it doesn't matter if it's, you know, a Japanese team or the English Premier League, Saudi Arabians are tweeting about it. So we would often monitor those hashtags just to see if ISIS was tweeting on them. So we could maybe conjecture that they were using those soccer hashtags more, but we never really observed any particular emphasis on one subject or another.
Yeah, I would say, no, go for it, Inez.
Well, yeah, I was just going to add that, and the reason for that is really because the goal is just amplification and getting the content out there, you know, riding the biggest wave of sorts, because ISIS's resources are somewhat constrained in terms of how long an account can stay up. Their main goal is just to amplify it as much as possible, and so in doing so, they look for the most viral hashtags.
Yeah, I'll just add that, like, it was a pretty unsophisticated way of doing things. Like, it was volume, but it was very crude in terms of, it was, you know, any and every hashtag. Like, it truly ranged from, you know, a K-pop star making a comment on TV to it being cold to soccer. Like, it was very in that way, which also made the work that we did really simple, because it was just so blaringly obvious that this ISIS content was online, and also kind of added to our concern that Twitter wasn't taking appropriate action.
I think that's a really interesting approach that they take. You know, another question we had was for Mr. Kevin Felix. And I think this is interesting because you guys talked about this idea that the US has really gotten on top of this in terms of IS, you know, the Islamic State. But, you know, obviously, based on your research, exploding within the Saudi Twitter sphere, and this affecting and having implications for US forces abroad and our allies and partners. What Kevin asked was, which allies and partners do you think we could use and leverage in this space? Was there anything in your research that you saw where there's already, you know, say somebody like the Jordanians really fighting this, or anything of that nature?
That is a really great question.
I have an initial idea, but I want to give Henry and Inez the opportunity to answer. I will just quickly say there were a big reason for the Khashoggi killing by Saudis was because he was starting to do a lot of work on exposing their state-sponsored disinformation and kind of hate speech that was happening on the platform. And so one of the reasons we initially turned to Saudi Arabia was we were really interested in how state-sponsored disinformation was happening on Twitter, and then we went down this crazy rabbit hole of ISIS. But I think clearing the way and removing state-sponsored disinformation, but then also ISIS content, would allow dissidents within the region to have a lot more space to actually correct the narrative. And so I think, if anything, the counter-messaging campaign can happen really locally and organically, which would have a lot of benefits for the region.
And
Sorry, Henry, go ahead.
Thanks. I think honestly the most effective kind of countermeasure that they could take is, rather than working with kind of a country locally, would be to go to Twitter directly. Because at the end of the day, this is a problem that can be most easily solved by the platform itself. And so it really comes down to like prevention and removal by Twitter, and they're definitely in the best position to curb the influence of campaigns like this.
That is a really great point, and we should really have a panel in the future on deplatforming. I think that would be great. All right. So we're going to go to another question then. One of our frequent participants, Ed Dos Santos Jr. What we wanted to ask was, in the contents as you're researching for those tweets, were those basic tweets, or was there anything secondary in terms of, were they putting metadata in there, anything that could collect information, anything advanced in those terms, or was it all pretty simplistic?
So there was definitely a range. I think the most poignant example is tweets that were using the software called If This Then That, which is basically just a tool that anyone can use to automate tweets. And I believe you now have the capability to remove metadata, but when ISIS used If This Then That, they did not take away the timestamp, so we could see exactly when they were posting these tweets. It would say like November 21st, 8:53 p.m., and then a series of hashtags that ISIS was trying to hijack. So we did see that sort of metadata or manipulation, but in some cases it was just a video and or just an infographic. Very rarely was it ever just a piece of text in like a regular old-fashioned tweet though.
Excellent. Thank you. I really appreciate that. So I'm going to have one more question from the audience and then one more question from the program real quick. I think this was interesting in terms of from EW Grover, what did you use as a baseline for normal volume of tweets? Did you see a flux based on holiday or geopolitical events? So if there was something like the Houthi attack on Saudis or anything of that nature, did you see a spike in those cases?
I don't think that we tracked too closely the specific, like any spike in volume on a given day, since our focus was more geared towards the impact that ISIS was having on that volume. Yeah, Fiona, Henry, do you have anything to add?
No, I mean, I think, yeah, we basically just collected what we had. And if we had perhaps maybe a larger hashtag, that might just be because it was like a more general thing. Like I believe our largest hashtag was the cold, and that's probably just because a lot of people are tweeting about the weather because it's general. But no, I don't think we did anything in terms of like baselining amounts.
It was a pretty, pretty run-of-the-mill week in the Middle East. Unfortunately, nothing crazy happened, so we couldn't really see any spikes given, political circumstances.
No, that makes perfect sense. Thank you so much. And so the last question, when we had kind of talked about in the Mad Scientist Initiative, and when we think about a lot in terms of the DoD implications and how do we get after this, because again, those implications affect us, affect our forces. And this might be a challenging question, but how do we flip this on its head? Is there anything you see where we can take advantage of them trying to infiltrate these spaces and becoming prolific besides just deplatforming with Twitter? How do we kind of turn it back around against the Islamic State?
Yeah, I think starting off with that in terms of combating the impact of this kind of content. And I saw a number of messages to this kind of that point to what I'm about to say in the chat. So everyone's very fast on this. So one obvious thing is when we looked at these specific tweets, there are clear patterns. There are timestamps. There are certain there are strategies that these accounts use to spread their message. And so that means that there are those are the fingerprints that Twitter can use to target these accounts. Or say maybe government operations can use to report these accounts to Twitter so that they can be taken down. And so I think the mass scale of this means that it can easily be turned against the Islamic State. And the same thing with the hub and spoke accounts that we looked at. If you get the hub taken down, you don't even need to find all the spokes because they will be tweeting dead links to the video that initially came from the hub account. And so the strategies that the Islamic State uses that allow their message to be spread so widely make them very vulnerable to takedowns by Twitter.
Yeah, I mean, as we were saying before, it's really crude. Like but Twitter is always going to be playing this cat and mouse game in terms of trying to get the content down as quickly as possible. And I think our research gave so much detail about what this actually looks like, and hopefully will provide more space for dissidents and locals within this Middle Eastern Twitter ecosystem to actually disseminate information that's relevant to them in order to create a better user experience for them.
I just want to briefly add to, in addition to these technical issues that we've identified, responding in the best way possible to the tactics that ISIS is using, in the long term, I would love to see an investment by Twitter into its employees working on specifically issues on the Middle East, and not just on the technical side, but really, be it just a partnership with a think tank that has a lot of expertise on Middle Eastern geopolitics or on the Islamic State, I think would go a long way in not just combating this immediate issue that we've researched, but really cleaning up the Middle Eastern Twitter sphere, which can be such a positive force, but currently has been marred by disinformation and by propaganda and things like this. So I would really love to see that investment by Twitter.
If anyone knows anyone at Twitter who can hire us, we'll very gladly do this work. Thank you so much for your time, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. So, sorry, go ahead.
No, that's all. Thank you.
Thanks so much to all three of you. That was an excellent presentation. And that was just our first one. So we have one more to go, and lo and behold, it's on deplatforming. So great questions, everyone. We're going to clear those out. And then as we get to the second panel and get ready to get started, then we will have more questions following that. So what I want to introduce for the next panel is we're going to be talking about deplatforming, deconstructed, a typology for technology platforms. So this next group is going to talk about something that was addressed a little bit in the last topic. So we're extremely excited to have this group. I'm going to allow them to introduce themselves, and we'll go through this wonderful presentation, and then we'll be ready for some more Q&A. So please keep the chat going, and remember, if you're going to ask questions, please put that in the Q&A function. So group, I'll hand it over to you.
All right, there. I will share our presentation. So my name is Maddox Angerhofer. I'm currently a sophomore in the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown. I'm majoring in international politics and minoring in Persian.
Hi, everybody. My name is Christina, and I'm an incoming privacy operations specialist at Facebook and a class of 2020 graduate from Georgetown, where I studied government and computer science.
Hi, everyone. My name is Bilva. I'm in the accelerated 5-year master's program in the security studies program at Georgetown. I just graduated from the School of Foreign Service, majoring in international politics with a focus on security. I have 1 more year of grad school left, and I'm concentrating in terrorism and sub-state violence. I currently work at 2 startups involved in the tech space, Signal Labs and One Defense.
Hi, everyone. My name is Ido. I am currently a graduate student at Georgetown Security Studies program, concentrating in tech and policy, and I'm going to graduate hopefully in May 2021.
Sounds good. So we're going to kick off our presentation. And so our goal here was to really elucidate different types of deplatforming strategies, and not necessarily to present a moral or ethical argument for deplatforming, but rather actually conduct a study in which we can effectively assess different types of deplatforming and create a typology that is both qualitative using quantitative data for technology platforms. And so our particular audience here was the Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism. And we believe that this project is really well suited, considering that they involve a variety of tech companies within their cohort. But we also think it's incredibly important for tech platforms in general to look at these policies and see which ones would fit them best. So moving on. So deplatforming can work. And I think the can here is really important because each use case that we focus on presents different conclusions about what deplatforming can do and what it can't do. And also we provide a variety of insights about user migration, which is what I think is really special about this project, because depending on which type of case we're looking at, there are different user migration implications, which we will elucidate later. So, okay, what does our typology actually focus on? So 3 different types of cases. 1 is a community takedown, 2 is an official page removal, and 3 is a public figure account suspension. We decided to pick these 3 because we found the greatest amount of data relating to these 3. And just to recreate the focus, we didn't randomize these studies. They were all involving the extreme right, and particularly a white supremacist contingent, which, as we know, has really been in the news recently considering current unrest. So even more important now to talk about it. And so community takedown is essentially when an entire community of users is disenfranchised from a platform, but they're not removed from the entire platform. Second, an official page removal, exactly what it sounds like. A page gets removed by the online platform, and so that content is entirely blocked. And lastly, we have a more traditional style of deplatforming when the user itself gets disenfranchised from a platform. So we focus specifically on public figures because we were able to see greater patterns of user migration here and actually see what type of power they were able to have. And so we focus on that for our 3rd type. So today I'll be talking about the community takedown, and what I decided to focus on was the 2015 Reddit case because it was a really grand case in this particular subcategory of deplatforming. In 2015, Reddit banned a bunch of different problematic threads. As you can see on this slide, I don't even want to read a lot of these considering how egregious they are, but some examples are Coontown, Fat People Hate, and so forth. The one that we particularly focused on was Coontown because it had the most racist, extreme right, white supremacist content within the platform. And so this community ban entirely changed the nature of speech on Reddit. It greatly marginalized the overall amount of hate speech, and it decreased the overall amount of hate speech on the entire platform. And another important part about this case study is that Reddit is an incredibly popular platform, and so it has a lot of viewers. In fact, it had in 2005, it boasted the 9th highest Alexa internet traffic rating, right? So this is a platform that is used by millions and millions of people. And so the implications of this case are vast. And so what we saw after this, which I'll touch on more later, was not only an inter-platform migration in which users moved from Reddit to other platforms, but also an intra-platform migration in which users on these particular virulent Reddit threads actually moved to less extreme threads that were still on the site, which is a really fascinating conclusion. So let's look at some case data. So right here, what we did was we built upon pre-existing studies, and this is kind of a general trend with a lot of our cases that we looked at. And so there was a case study conducted by a PhD team of human computing researchers that specifically looked at different algorithms that were used to hone in on the 2015 Reddit case. So right here, you can see on the chart, that's like the mean amount of hate speech, and the vertical line is when the deplatforming of Coontown happened. So you can see the experiment group dramatically decreases the overall amount of hate speech on Reddit. And so the decrease in hate speech was actually by 81.08% as dictated by the study within Coontown, which is a very big deal considering that Coontown was in the top 2% of subreddits at the time prior to its deplatforming. And so you can effectively say that this community takedown worked in that the overall amount of hate speech on Reddit was significantly decreased by the removal of just this one thread. It's also important to look at what happened to the users in Coontown. So did they stay on Reddit? Did they leave? And so according to the study, 21% of them actually deactivated their Reddit account, which is important because I guess we can infer from that data that a lot of these users were no longer interested in using Reddit because they couldn't exercise their free speech on the platform. And so they would probably belong to a more extremist contingent, even within that subgroup. So essentially, we saw a major disenfranchisement and disengagement within the platform. So next, we're going to move on to some community implications in terms of user migration. Ooh, some technical difficulties. Perfect. Okay, so here we have a couple of charts that I'll explain in further detail. But essentially what happened was that there was intra-platform migration and inter-platform migration. So to tackle the first thing, the intra-platform migration, a lot of the users that were in Coontown moved to other subreddits, less extreme ones that were still up on the site, a lot of which some of you might be familiar with, such as The Donald, Black Crime Matters, and Homeland. So still hubs of extremist, problematic content, but not content that is dangerous enough for Reddit to remove, at least at the time. And so they moved to these threads, but what the original study conducted by these PhD researchers found was that the overall amount of hatred and content on these newly migrated threads did not increase. It relatively remained at the status quo, which is really important because just because the more extreme users of these older contingents moved to these newer threads, that does not necessarily mean that they espoused greater hate content or made those threads necessarily more hateful, which is a really interesting finding of the study. And so in terms of the original research that I looked at here was kind of looking at where they went. So after looking at a lot of news articles and deep diving into the Internet Archive and Alexa search traffic, we found out that they moved from Reddit to much smaller platforms such as Vote, and as many of you know, 8chan, which is now known as 8kun. So they moved to these smaller platforms and platforms more traditionally used by the extreme right or white supremacist communities. And so Vote experienced a spike of 700,000 users. And so you can see in the Vote search traffic chart from the data that I pulled up, you can see in between June 11th and July 12th, there's a 2.6% increase in search traffic. And in the graph as well, you can see the huge increase in users on Vote. So that was largely because of the Reddit deplatforming. And what happened was, since Vote is such a small platform that can't really handle such user volume, it temporarily disbanded and was unable to function. So this is another really important implication of user migration, in that when these extremist elements migrate to smaller platforms, sometimes these smaller platforms can't really take that volume. And that's really important to highlight, especially for tech companies and those smaller platforms as well, to determine what their future would look like when they have to house new users. And so there's the other graphic on the right side shows Alexa traffic as well, but it shows that many users, before they went to Vote, went to Reddit first. So it's clear that a lot of the community that used to be housed on Reddit had to move to smaller platforms. And so there's a huge trend of larger to smaller platform migration, which I think is vital to highlight, because it also shows that these people used to have such a large contingent and such a large base of their own internet constituents were largely robbed of that when they moved to Vote, which is a much smaller community, and the site couldn't even take the influx at first. So these are some really, really vital user migration implications. And just to round it off, the community takedown just shows how effective deplatforming can be when you're not just deplatforming a singular individual, but rather an entire community of hateful users, and limiting their ability to gain influence online.
So now for the second category of our typology, we tackled official page removal. Our first case study concerned Britain First, which is a far-right quasi-political party in the UK. I call it a quasi-political party because several of its leaders have been arrested, and largely because of social media deplatforming efforts, the organization has lost much of its legitimacy in recent years as a political entity. So Paul Golding is one of the leaders who you see in this graphic. He received jail time for religiously motivated harassment in 2017. Shortly after his arrest, official pages for Britain First were removed from Facebook and Twitter, followed by a couple other smaller platforms. In the bottom right, we have the Google search trend, and you'll notice a sharp spike in this trend immediately after the 2017 deplatforming. So importantly, this spike in search interest didn't last very long. As you can see, it was about maybe a month, quite a sharp spike before it returns back to pre-deplatforming levels of interest in Britain First. So we attributed this spike in search traffic to the immediate attention on the deplatforming, but clearly it wasn't converted into long-lasting interest as measured by people's Google searches. Another piece of evidence that confirms that Britain First enjoyed no lasting boost in support is this huge decline in followers of the official page. So before being deplatformed, Britain First's page on Facebook had 1.8 million followers. After being deplatformed, Britain First moved its official page over to Gab, a secondary site that's kind of a spin-off of Twitter. But that page only got about 11,000 followers at its peak. The migration of followers of Britain First's official pages from mainstream sites like Facebook and Twitter to secondary sites like Gab was very limited. Despite Britain First's best efforts to encourage migration, like using this propaganda or these graphics that recommend moving platforms, the shift of users from secondary sites like Gab to tertiary sites was even smaller. So we do not see a huge increase in users who follow Britain First on Telegram, for example. It's clear that Britain First lost the vast majority of its online supporters, and the dissociation of Britain First from the recognizable brands of big companies like Facebook and Twitter caused Britain First to lose a lot of its standing in as a legitimate political entity in the UK. For our second one, we're gonna have to leave again. It keeps freezing. There we go. So our second official page removal case concerned InfoWars, which is the media conglomerate led by Alex Jones. InfoWars pages were removed nearly wholesale from third-party platforms across the internet in 2018, primarily for terms of service violations related to hate speech. Even the more stringent deplatformings, like the moderation action taken by Twitter, did not fully succeed in removing InfoWars content from the platforms. As recently as this past April, we found Facebook groups like InfoWars America devoted to sharing and discussing InfoWars content. And some of these groups had huge numbers of members, relatively speaking, like the 3,500 here. We see suggestions of intra-platform migration here, where users shift between subsets of a single social media platform, like, for example, switching between Facebook groups or moving from following an official page on Facebook to just belonging to a group. This is not to say that the InfoWars deplatforming failed, though. The moderation efforts by Facebook and other platforms did, in fact, reduce the circulation of and the access to InfoWars content all across the internet. Alex Jones and InfoWars can't rely on the well-developed social media algorithms of big companies to promote their products anymore. For a short time, much like in the case of Britain First, media coverage of the deplatforming took the place of these social media algorithms in promoting InfoWars. But again, as you can see in the Alexa web traffic ranking, the increased traffic to Infowars.com, which was the independently hosted website that could not be removed by just deplatforming InfoWars from Facebook. Although it increased drastically for a little while after the moderation actions in 2018, the increased interest didn't last very long and was reduced to pre-deplatforming levels shortly thereafter. Indeed, after the deplatforming, combined visits and views to Infowars.com were actually cut totally in half, from 1.4 million to about 700,000. Taken together, the two cases of official page removal reveal that while media coverage may cause short-term elevated interest, these organizations are not necessarily able to convert this into long-lasting or continued support, and certainly not into higher follower counts. Removal from mainstream social media makes it harder for these organizations to promote themselves and to promote their agendas, especially since they can't piggyback off the reputation of large, well-known platforms.
Okay, so what we wanted to check next is the impact of the removal of a public figure's account on their followers' migration in between platforms. To do that, we looked at the accounts of three prominent alt-right figures, At the top left corner is Milo Yiannopoulos, a former Breitbart columnist. At the top right corner is Paul Joseph Woodson, who is a British citizen and an InfoWorks contributor. And at the bottom is Laura Loomer, who is an American, a prominent alt-right figure. All three of them were removed in May 2019 by Facebook, and Loomer specifically was also removed in November 2018 by Twitter. What we looked at was the remaining accounts' follower growth rate, which we calculated based on their archive versions taken from the Internet Archive. In the above graph, you can see the follower growth rate of Yiannopoulos and Woodson's remaining profiles. As you can see, the impact appears to be very minimal. Their YouTube accounts didn't experience any change in their follower growth rate around the dates of removal. Specifically, Woodson's Twitter account did experience an unusual 25,000 rise in his following for the Twitter account. But compared to the then 900,000 followers that the account had, the trend appears to be much less notable than in the below graph, which represents Laura Loomer's YouTube follower growth rate between November 2018 and May 2019. In this 6-month period, Loomer's account experienced a quarterly rise of 25,000 followers. Again, these numbers are much more apparent given Loomer's significantly lower following to begin with. What we looked at next is the three's most popular accounts compared to the accounts that have been removed. As we can see, Woodson's most popular account remains his YouTube account with 1.8 million followers, which he continues to operate. In Yiannopoulos and Loomer's cases, their most popular accounts, Facebook and Twitter, respectively, were removed, which eventually led to about a 2/3 shrinkage in the overall number of their followers. So our conclusions based on the examinations of these use cases are that deplatforming of public figures in the alt-right does not necessarily lead to significant cross-platform follower migration. In cases that we did see minor cross-platform migration, we believe that this migration was by a more loyal nucleus of followers, and in both Loomer and Woodson's case, these amounted to about 25,000 followers per removal in average. And our third conclusion is that in order for a deplatforming strategy to be maximally effective, a better cooperation is required between the big platforms, and that the use case of Woodson showcases that by eventually showing how Woodson managed to maintain the vast majority of his network using remaining accounts.
All right, so I'm just going to be concluding our presentation then by re-emphasizing our key findings and advocating for the related recommendations that our team has for organizations that are hoping to improve upon extant work in the online extremism sphere. So first off, for key findings, for the first type of the study deplatforming, which is again the community takedown, we found that banning extremist communities can reduce the prevalence of hate across the entire platform, and that it does trigger substantial migration that opens up a space for meaningful bilateral and multilateral efforts to make a difference. Second, for official page removals, we found that this type of deplatforming is very successful in reducing the prevalence of a targeted organization's content on that specific platform, but it doesn't necessarily prevent conversations about that organization continuing on the platform. And so we recommend its use really by companies that are seeking to distance themselves from a particular organization or slow its expansion. And then finally, as we just heard from Ido, for public figure account suspensions, we found that this type of deplatforming really does limit the public reach of these figures and triggers little to no migration. However, as a policy, it's applied somewhat inconsistently, which can at times undermine its legitimacy. Next slide. And so, with that, while we queue up those slides, our final recommendations are we have four for organizations that are seeking to move forward in this sphere. And so the first is increased cooperation and oversight. So we recommend both proactive and reactive information sharing and cooperation between companies facilitated by bilateral agreements or multilateral organizations. And so, what this could look like, for example, is if a platform plans to initiate a deplatforming campaign, it could reach out to other organizations in the social media ecosystem that it predicts will be impacted so that they can prepare. And then in turn, when the event occurs, those organizations could reactively share statistics on how they were impacted and how they went about receiving or rejecting those new users. Our second recommendation is transparency around standards and processes. So with this, we just believe that clearer industry standards are needed and that they must be communicated to the public in an accessible manner to increase the legitimacy and efficacy of enforcement efforts. Our third recommendation is enforcement of hate speech policies. So our research shows that the immediate period after a deplatforming event is really critical. And so with that, stringent enforcement of these policies, both on a platform and across the larger social media ecosystem, are crucial, especially in the aftermath of each deplatforming event that occurs. And so our fourth recommendation is further research. So our research was largely focused on public membership-based indicators that were available to us as external researchers, but we also conceptualized additional metrics and indicators that companies themselves would be able to calculate using internal data, and that we're convinced will be invaluable to assessing the full effects of deplatforming on the social media ecosystem. And what these statistics could look like, for example, are statistics that are more granular and based on how a user engages with a group and the activities that they take across a platform. And so with that, we just want to conclude our presentation by emphasizing that our work on deplatforming of white supremacist communities really draws this crucial connection between deplatforming phenomena in all of its different forms with the phenomena of user migration specifically. And so we see this as a crucial area for further work seeking to mitigate online extremism, since it really emphasizes the dynamic nature of engagement with this type of content. And so with that, we want to thank you all for your time and open up the floor to questions.
That was an excellent presentation. Really appreciate you all presenting this phenomenal research. It was really great. So we're going to open it up, as you said, to questions now. So the first question that I want to get in was from Bernard Bricks, is what's listed here. And so what happens is, as you all addressed this idea, and probably not as much as they would hope, but as those folks are deplatformed and they migrate to these new areas, these new social media platforms, is there a risk there in terms of, as we deplatform and they become out of that echo chamber, but they don't necessarily have that place to vent that particular hate speech or things like that? Have you looked at all in linkage in terms of radicalization at that point? So do those folks potentially become more radicalized as they are kind of forced out or marginalized, as it were, from those platforms?
Yeah, I guess I could kick this off. That's a really good question, and something that we often saw in our research. And I think it's important to really look at the pros and cons of either leaving them on the platform or deplatforming them in their migration. And both of those do come with pros and cons. I think in terms of where these users go, I mean, we've seen from the Reddit case study, for example, they went to Vote, which is lot smaller than Reddit is, and therefore a lot more extremist of a hub. It's been historically known to house white supremacists. But even worse than Vote is when they move to places like Gab and Telegram, in which they have these smaller communities that is difficult to tap into because they're not necessarily public. They might be end-to-end encrypted, and therefore that makes it difficult for the public sector to track them. So I think, yes, that is an important consideration, but I think maybe we should take a step back and think about how deplatforming can help prevent them from further radicalizing others. I think when you have an echo chamber of a very radical, hateful community, and that echo chamber is readily accessible to millions of others, there's a great chance that they can pull others into that echo chamber, versus when they're forced into a much smaller system in which they can only interact with each other. They might freely be able to engage in hate speech, but there's only a certain amount of people. There's like a maximum limit of the amount of people that can actually engage with that community, which I see as a really big positive as a result of deplatforming. We also found in our research how law enforcement initiatives to tackle such cases are more directed, in that they can infiltrate, I guess, with the right jurisdiction, they can infiltrate a Telegram group or a group on Gab or much smaller platforms or certain encrypted communities in order to pursue investigations of particular groups, rather than looking on more widespread sites such as Reddit or official pages. So I think there are definitely costs and benefits to both sides.
I'd like to add as well that the choice of deplatforming someone is a pretty severe moderation tactic, and probably should be mostly employed in cases where the scale of radicalization is what's of concern, which is part of why we focused on either large communities, official pages, or public figures with large followings. In the case of individuals, if you're concerned with the radicalization of one person sitting behind their laptop, other perhaps slightly less severe moderation tactics might be preferable, like, for example, shadow banning, where the user doesn't even know that their content is being downgraded. And so that would be less likely to have those kind of negative effects on the individual.
No, those are fantastic insights. And then we have another question again from EW Grover. And so the question is there an economic incentive at all to deplatforming? So really in the beginning, your incentive, right, and your focus as that social media platform when it comes to profit is to get more users so that you can target them with advertising. Is there a flip to that? Is there economic incentive in deplatforming at all, or is this purely something they're going to have to do from a public relations standpoint, and for whatever ethical or ethos that they have?
I would say there certainly is an economic incentive to deplatforming. Just how we mentioned that in the case of organizations with pages on large social media platforms, piggyback off the reputation of Facebook or Twitter to get their name out and to promote their brand. The brand of Facebook and Twitter suffers from this same promotion at the same time. And so I think there is a business incentive to moderate platforms so that they don't become chock full of extremist content and groups that have been widely denounced.
No, I think that's excellent insights. And so let me go to another question. And this question is from Ankushi Mitra. I apologize if I butchered the name. Can you speak to the potential efficacy of not just deplatforming, but ideas of soft deplatforming? I know you talked a little bit recently about shadow bans just recently, but what about ideas in terms of fact checks, like what Twitter has been doing, or we've seen Facebook that potentially has had alerts on things that might be either hate speech or fake news, as it were. So what do you think in terms of, is there room for what we could call half measures?
Yeah, I can start. So we looked at this a little bit, but we were unfortunately limited by the data in which we could possess. Ideally, if you are a member of that company or you're the platform itself, you have access to a mass amount of big data considering all of your users. And so we obviously don't have private user data. But I think if we did have private user data, it would be really beneficial. And this goes back to our further research section. It would be really beneficial to look at these more fact-checking approaches. And I know one of them that Twitter has done previously is decreasing search visibility. So it's kind of like the in-between of deplatforming shadow banning, in which a particular user that could be problematic is kind of sanctioned to a certain space in which it's very difficult to find the user, but they're not necessarily entirely banned. Like, people could see their profile, it just doesn't populate as much or as quickly on certain feeds, which is kind of an ingenious approach to it. And there's other things too, such as demonetization, which companies have taken before. Unfortunately, we weren't able to conduct analyses of these things just because we didn't have access to the sweeping user data that we would need. And if anyone else wants to jump in.
All right, well, we'll take that then. I have a kind of a two-part question. The first part from what I'll call the Mad Mississippian, Mr. Lee Grubbs, our director, on the line. And what about users, and were you able to track anything in this about users that just change their information? And then in terms of it's the same user, but they're under a different username, or they varied it in some small form, and given the automated tasks to take place. And then the question I had linked to that as well, kind of segueing, is for those who put out legitimate information as well, maybe a state, a state type official or a government official or someone in a prominent position that puts out, generally speaking, legitimate information, and then sometimes varies into that disinformation or hate speech rhetoric. How do you deal with the contention between those two issues? So that's kind of a two-parter there.
I guess I can take the first part then. So a lot of the research that we presented to you guys was largely based on aggregate statistics or on very public individuals. And that's largely because we think it would be somewhat dangerous in terms of privacy if, especially large companies were able to focus and track an individual that isn't necessarily a public figure or newsworthy to such a degree of granularity. And so we think that why those types of statistics might be very valuable, to see if a user can simply change their name and come back again on the community. It would be somewhat dangerous maybe, or require a bit more insight and review to initiate those more individual level checks.
I'd like to answer the second part. I think when we talk about deplatforming, we have, and this has been shown by the recent events with Donald Trump's tweets and the disagreement between Twitter and Facebook. I think it's clear that it's also a question of policy, and I think that it's a difficult one. It's not just a matter of how, it's a matter of if and to what extent. And when it comes to mixed news, to misinformation, disinformation, and to setting the boundaries of what is a legitimate form of speech, I think it's really a question of policy, and I think it's a question that every company would maintain in the short term the right to decide on where that boundary stands. Whereas our research, trying to refrain from any normative saying, focused mainly on questions of efficiency, of whether or not deplatforming actually is a efficient way of minimizing the exposure of radical right ideas. And that, our findings appear to suggest that it does.
Just one more comment on that gray area between when an actor is like potentially posting both true and false information and potentially difficult to distinguish. The example of InfoWars was a good case where lots of people had wanted InfoWars taken down off of social media for years, but because it wasn't necessarily violating any rules on these specific platforms, the content stayed up, and InfoWars was able to continue using Facebook and Twitter and all of these sites. But when the deplatforming actually occurred, it was because of specific terms of use violations that Facebook and Twitter could point to and say, this goes against our terms of service, and this is why we've taken down the page. And that's something that's been brought up in the recent discussions of amending or revising current, like Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, or just changing the way that social media platforms are treated by requiring them to have more explicitly written out terms of service policies and requiring them to enforce those more stringently.
Excellent answers. I really appreciate it. This has been fantastic. We actually have a couple Q&A still on the line. Unfortunately, we are running out of time, but this has just been a really fascinating conversation. I really want to thank our partners at Georgetown University, at the Center for Security Studies, and also Georgetown University School of Foreign Services at the Centennial Labs. This has been, all our presenters were really phenomenal. I want to thank the audience for logging on, participating. Once again, we had phenomenal question and answer session. Make sure you follow us at ArmyMadSci on Twitter. You can come to the blog, madsciblog.tradoc.army.mil. You can also check out our podcast, The Convergence, an Army Mad Scientist podcast on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, Google Play, anywhere where you get your podcasts. And continue, please, to, again, check out the blog as we have more events leading out into the future. Really want to thank again everyone for coming on. An excellent event. Remember, this is recorded and it will be available on our All Partners Access Network site, which you can find again via the blog and our YouTube site as well. So thank you again, everybody, and we look forward to talking to you all again soon in the future.